A work of art, a piece of music, a painting, architecture, dance, sculpture, a novel. A work of art is a combination of form and content. There's a tendency in modern writers not to realize that a story is designed like a piece of sculpture. It has a design to it. And they often, writers, young writers especially, want to write autobiographically, and they think if they just pour their experience out in a diary-like way and just flood the pages with words, that this is enough. And that's content, it's material, and therefore you're going to have to design it. And so I stress for writers to take the same attitude toward their story that a great sculptor would take toward their sculpture, and realize that there's 360 degrees of shape here, top and bottom, and you have to design these things and do it in such a way that it looks like it just fell out of your head. This first step to write anything, hoping that it's going to be good, is you've got to find your subject. The first idea that comes into your head could be anything. Could be a dream you have one night, could be something you see on a street, could be something in somebody else's novel or film, it could be a memory. I mean, something is going to arouse your curiosity and make you want to explore that subject. The inspiration, the first idea, you do not keep, because all that inspiration becomes is the first idea. And it leads you to wonder, who are these people, what could their life be like, and so forth. And as you get into it, you realize, I don't want to write about that. I want to write about this part of that or something else. And so the inspiration is important because it gets you writing, it makes you curious, it makes you look for a subject, but often it's a false subject that you consciously thought you wanted to write about, but subconsciously, actually, there's something else that your mind really wants to write about. Well, you have to be very intelligent, okay? You have to be an observer of life. You don't have to necessarily participate actively. You don't have to be a hero of some kind, but you have to be out in the world paying attention to the way people behave. You have to be a great reader. Writers read. And that the greatest knowledge that young writers get from, to fill their mind with ideas they get from reading, great writing, novels, going to films, going to the theater, and studying other people's writing. And the most important talent or skill is to be able to look inside of themselves and come to understand themselves as a human being. Because self-knowledge is the root of all great character writing. The truth is, in life, there's only one person that you ever know, and that is yourself. People who wait for inspiration never create anything of value. It is romantic, delusional thinking. You have talent. Let's presume talent, okay? Talent is a muscle. It's a power that you have in the right brain to take the material of life and discover a hidden connection between things that are already in your head, but to put them together in a third way nobody else has ever done before. This is talent. It's analogical logic, okay? You can do this because you were born that way. Now, you must work. From all I know from writers, the best moments, the best experiences they have come on those days when they don't feel like writing. You have no direct access to your talent. This is the illusion of inspiration. The illusion of inspiration is I have direct access to my talent. And if I put myself into the right mood, I will just go into my talent and pull out of that, and this is complete nonsense. So the professor's right. You have a standard. I think 1 page a day is a rather low standard. I would think 1,000 words. You can throw them away the next day. Okay, fine. Because when you're in the harness and you're concentrating and you're describing character, just describing what you see out the window, or asking yourself what would happen if, and then, you know, even if your fingers are paralyzed on the keys, you know, just being there, right? Suddenly, from out of nowhere, your talent throws something into your head, right? When it wants to, not at your command, and then, okay? And so I say discipline. You sit down and you write. You might write shit, but you write. And you do this 6, 7 days a week, certain number of hours a day, certain number of words a day, okay? And you produce work. What's very important for any artist is to realize that 90% of what you do is not your best work. How are you going to get 100% of excellence into your work? You have to write 10 times more material. Throw out the 90% of banality and only keep the 10% of excellence. People who believe in inspiration think that everything they write is wonderful. Stories are metaphors for life, and human life has not essentially changed. Culture is a difference, of course, but culture, as I said, is about this thick, right? Human nature underneath that surface of culture is bottomless. And so the surface does change things from different periods and different places in the world. There are different concerns. In very materialistic societies, often people have tremendous inner conflicts because they have great material success, but their lives seem empty and meaningless. In the Middle East, people are just trying to survive. And so the level of conflict there is life and death. In Paris, it might be, you know, an existential conflict. But the form is the same. It's desire, meeting certain forces of antagonism, taking actions that swing the life from the positive to the negative, positive, negative, on one of those levels. So the values change, the levels of conflict change, but the form is universal. I know your classics, of course, the great films from the past, like Kiss of the Spider Woman and Donna Fleur and Her Two Husbands and Quixote and Central Station. Wonderful films. City of God. You know, that periodically, every year or two, a film would come out of Brazil that would just astound the world. And Brazilian cinema had a great international presence, but that has diminished somewhat in recent years. I would hope that Brazilian film would ignite again, but there's very little, too little, original screenwriting. And so-called auteur directors are cannibals of novels. They cannot create original characters and original stories. And they may have great talent in terms of directing and photographing all of this, but they cannot create original material. So what do? They get a novel. Now, in the past, novelists told wonderful stories, but the modern novelist today, less and less. The modern novelist now is a very interior monologue of thoughts and feelings of characters, often very autobiographical. They're more memoir or confession, and they're all taking place in the mind of the first-person narrator. When you go to make a film out of this, you have enormous problems because you cannot photograph thought. All you have is the gestures and the face and the voice of the actor, Whereas the novelist can go into the mind and lay out on the page all these thoughts and feelings in a beautiful way that really pulls the reader through the book. But suddenly, it's a movie, and you have to find a cinematic equivalent for literary thought and feeling, and that's extremely difficult. So what you end up with is very passive stories, passive characters in passive situations, and the film is full of beautiful photography. Well, I just recently watched Avenida Brazil, and there was a wonderful, wonderful. The creators of this, I sat there saying, they've read my book. They've read my book.
Maybe.
I thought,
Maybe
every single scene was a turning point of some magnitude. You'd come into the scene one way, you come out another way. It was fantastic, fantastic. And as I said, they're enormous works.
Yeah.
Wonderful characters, wonderful characters. So it was, and the spirit was comedy, right?
Good.
Yeah, a lot of murders and terrible things happening to people, but the spirit was satire and a basically comedic spirit, a certain amount of exaggeration, right, of character types, and exaggeration of action, which is what we do in comedy. In comedy, we take things and make it a little bigger than necessary in order to provoke a critical eye so that you don't get too emotionally involved. And that exaggeration is there to keep the mind sharp in the audience. And so the spirit was comic and wonderfully done. So yeah, it's a great form. The form is the same. The difference is that a film might be 3, 4, 5 acts, perhaps more. A film like Raiders of the Lost Ark, I think it was in 7 acts. And so you have something between 3, maybe 6 or 7 acts in a film inside of 2.5 hours. In television, you have 100 hours. And so the number of acts multiplies fantastically. And so you also will need a number of storylines. And so the quantity of material in television is enormous compared to a feature film. But the form is the same, fundamentally. And so you still have an inciting incident, you have progressive complications, you have building need and desires and characters, you have the same kind of concerns that shape a feature film, but in television, the multitude of more material, but in no fundamental way does anything change. Law and Order was one of the, it ran for 20 years, 22 times a year, 440 episodes. And it's an amazing success. And they had a form that was just brilliant, which was that would start with a closed mystery. They'd find a dead body in an alley and then say something sarcastic over the corpse, because that's sort of Law and Order invention. And then it would start professionally. But by 15 minutes into the hour, something about this investigation would push the personal buttons of one of those detectives, and it would go from professional to personal. Then, half an hour into it, they'd find the perpetrator, and they'd pass the baton to the prosecutors, and it started professionally all over again. But then something about the prosecution pushed a button on one of the prosecutors, and it went from professional to personal for the prosecutors, and this would break up all kinds of ethical problems. That design worked for 20 years, and they changed the cast, of course, over the years, many times, but the form was so strong, and the writing in Law and Order was superb. And I was very sad when it ended, because I thought after 20 years it was getting even better. Even better. And the writers who wrote Law and Order many of them were playwrights. New York playwrights who wrote Law and Order episodes to put braces on their children's teeth. And the quality of that writing was really great. House is a spin-off of Sherlock Holmes, right? And House's sidekick was not Watson, but was it Watson?
No, it was Wilson.
Wilson.
Yeah.
Watson became Wilson. Holmes became House, and the forensics of medicine became the puzzles that Sherlock Holmes used to face. And so, yeah, House is a great character. And the writers took that character in a direction that Sherlock Holmes would never go. He was one of the most irritating, right? I mean, Sherlock Holmes had his violin and his opium, and he had a certain distant character, but he wasn't irritating. And House was this pain in the ass guy, and people loved him, right? Because he had high standards, and and he wasn't going to settle for the easy solutions and on that. And as a persevering scientific detective, you only hope that if I get sick, there'll be House there to make sure that the hospital doesn't kill me. Okay, yeah, that was a great series, great characters. There's two great impulses in storytelling, which is the optimistic, idealistic, to tell stories about life as it should be, right? And that's wonderful. And then there's the pessimistic point of view, the realistic pessimistic point of view, which is to tell stories as they really are. And I think what's obviously happened is that the idealism has worn itself out, and that only very young people still love heroes.
Okay.
And that the television watching mature audience realizes that this is not the way life is. But Breaking Bad, Nurse Jackie, Dexter even, right? There's always the promise in these stories that these dark characters will somehow grow and change into a better human being. I mean, we keep hoping that Dexter, will come to terms with his demon. I mean, it was really great when Dexter finally realized, I call him my dark passenger, but it's me.
Yeah.
That was a big moment when he stopped lying to himself, pretended that he was some sort of doppelganger and not responsible, right?
Yeah.
And so when Dexter finally realized, no, it's me, right? I went, oh, Dexter's growing up. Tony Soprano was one of the great anti-heroes, right? I just wanted Tony, he goes to a psychiatrist, trying to understand himself, and you want Tony to achieve self-awareness. I mean, we don't need him to become a moral human being or quit the mob or anything nonsense like that, but if he could just understand himself and become self-aware. And for 88 hours, I kept waiting, is Tony ever going to get it? And he never got it. Film has become very, in the United States we call politically correct. You have to be very careful in film not to offend certain people. And consequently, the subject matter and the treatment of that subject matter in film is shrinking. Television just opens its arms and takes it all in. It looks at all levels of society, and in a big, huge format, 100 hours, 200 hours, very complex psychologies and very complex casts and relationships to generate storytelling over dozens and dozens of hours. And in American television in particular, in the subscription television in America, there is no limit on subject matter. Consequently, you have enormous freedom. You can say things and do things on television in America. They would shoot you if you did that in a feature film. It would never be released. It would just never get made. What's happening in Hollywood is that what would have been screenwriters are leaving film, and they're going over to television. And the great ambition now for young writers is not to create the great American film, but to create the great American television series. And film, as I said, has become very narrowed in the way in which it approaches storytelling. But in television, the techniques of storytelling are wild. There's a series in American television called Damages. Stars Glenn Close. And it was written by my students, 3 guys from Harvard. And they developed a technique that we'd never seen before in the movies, which is to use flash forwards to hook the audience. No one ever did that before. And they would flash forward toward the climax of the series, which is, 12 hours away, 12 episodes away, and give you little glimpses of the future, so that the audience was permanently in a state of dramatic irony. The audience watching Damages always knew more than the characters knew. In other TV series, there's a lot of magical realism. There's a lot of interplay between fantasy and reality. There's a lot of unreliable narrating, we call it. You could never be certain in a series like The Sopranos whether the scene you're watching is reality or fantasy or hallucination or dream or memory or flash forward, what? And so the experimentation with the storytelling art in television is far greater than the experimentation in film. I think it's all for the good in 2 ways. One, because of technology now, anything that a writer imagines can be created. There's no limits to your fantasies, to your dreams, to the worlds, impossible worlds that you can dream up can all be created. And at a surprisingly small price. I mean, it's expensive, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper to do this, okay? But what you need is talent. You need great graphic artists, you need great people who can take those visions and put them on the screen. So on one hand, the technology is fantastic. It opens up the imagination. The other thing, the other aspect of technology is wonderful is time. Stories now can be longer than they've ever been before. A 1,000-page novel, James Joyce's Ulysses was at one point in history thought to be the maximum size of something. But now it's, you have 100 hours, 200 hours of storytelling, and consequently the complexity of character goes beyond anything that James Joyce imagined. And you have complex casts and character relationships dramatized out over literally hundreds of hours. And so the creative possibilities for the writer now is to create stories that will be the 21st century equivalent of the cathedral, huge, massive works of complex art. And so the technology now has made it possible to dream any dream for as long as you want. And if you have the talent to hook the interest of the audience, hold that interest, deepen it, and satisfy it for 100 hours, 200 hours, it's breathtaking. There's never been anything like this in history. We've never had an opportunity to create stories of this complexity and magnitude before. This is a great moment in the history of Brazil. The government has done a very wise thing, which is insisting that a certain percentage of the content of cable television, or subscription television, be original work in Brazil by Brazilian artists. It's tough, and everybody's under great pressure, but it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, your Brazilian culture will become a subset of American culture. One culture tends to fill another cultural vacuum. And if Brazil allows itself to become a cultural vacuum, then American culture, French culture, some foreign culture will fill that vacuum. If you don't take care of it, other people will. Because the audience is going to consume films and television and novels, and if they're not made and created by Brazilians, there'll be somebody else. And over time, these foreign cultures will determine who is a Brazilian. And so they've done the right thing. And I believe that, that television is the future, and that the great masterpieces of storytelling art will be long-form television, what you call the telenovela. And that this is going to rise up in the world, as it is today, in America and elsewhere, rise up and become the great masterpieces of story art for the 21st century. And the government has set Brazilian broadcasters on the right track to begin to take the telenovela to another level of brilliance.